One of the big stories of the year, at least as far as DreamWorks is concerned, was the release of the live-action adaptation of How to Train Your Dragon. I think when it was first announced, there was a lot of skepticism about the project in general. The world has had many live-action remakes over the years of beloved animated projects, but most of these were from Disney. This was the first time DreamWorks was going to dip their toes in, and I think a lot of people thought it was going to be a flop and a failure. After all, the Disney remakes had been a case of diminishing returns before the mega smash hit of Lilo and Stitch, and I think there was the thought that How to Train Your Dragon was just not what the modern audience was looking for. Of course, that was not the reality of the situation at all. The film ended up being a hit, probably the biggest hit the franchise has ever had. I say probably, but it actually just is. The OG How to Train Your Dragon grossed $494 million off of $165 million. The second film, $621 million off of $145 million, and then the third, $540 million off of $129 million. The live-action remake, though, has come out ahead, grossing $626 million off of $150 million. It's done very well for itself financially. I think that's very clear to see, and for the most part, it got a decent reception. It has a 76% critical approval rating and a 97% audience approval rating. Does it do everything perfectly? No. But at the same time, it's nowhere near the terrible movie that some corners of the internet would have you believe. Of course, off the back of such a successful film, I think it would be malpractice if they didn't make a sequel. And of course, one has already been greenlit with the release penciled in for 2027. I realise there's going to be some people that just shake their heads at yet another remake in the franchise, but I'm just happy to see DreamWorks have a win for once. I fully expect they're going to be following through on creating the whole trilogy, although I am curious as to whether they've already hit their peak and every subsequent film is going to be a case of diminishing returns. Or will the films keep gaining momentum and becoming more and more successful the further along we go? I suppose we'll just have to wait and see on that score, but for now, I do want to talk about the future of the second movie. When the first How to Train Your Dragon remake was announced, there was part of me that just wanted a straight one-to-one adaptation that simply made it all come alive in a new format. That would be all well and good, I thought to myself. However, the closer we got to a release, the more I started thinking about how there was room for more. A chance for the live actions to set themselves apart and do their own thing while still hitting those core story points for the franchise. Keep the bones the same, but then some of the content would differ. Kind of like Maleficent, the first one. They still hit those key important story points, but at the same time, the way in which they reached them and the way in which the characters evolved was presented differently. This is how I think How to Train Your Dragon could have done things, as with a longer runtime comes the potential for further character building and fleshing out of story and character dynamics. More exploration of Stoic and Hiccup beyond Hiccup weak, Stoic angry. Don't get me wrong, we did get a little bit of that, but it did feel like the majority of that extra runtime was simply showcasing action. I will admit there are a lot of good action sequences, and I'm not complaining, but I just think there could have been room for more, if that makes sense. Even then though, in a lot of ways, that is just adding some seasoning to the story. The first film was already really good on its own, and you don't need to change much for a satisfying storyline. I'm not that certain that a second film can always say the same. I'm no longer talking about simply adding things to help enhance. I'm talking about outright changing story beats or character dynamics to make for a more narratively satisfying conclusion. As you could easily see from the title, we're obviously talking about the storyline of Valka. I'll be honest with you, I didn't much like her. Actually no, that's not the right way of putting it. I don't think the character herself necessarily sucks, but it's more her inclusion in the story feels badly written at times when you're looking back. Okay, so let's just run through the actual storyline before we make any complaints. Once upon a time, Valka lived on the island of Berk as part of the Hooligan tribe and was in love with Stoic the Vast. She was clearly a warrior of some sort, hence the boob helmets that Stoic had commissioned after she died, but at the same time, she always believed there was more to the dragons than just being mindless killing machines. She sort of serves the Hiccup outcast type of vibe, but probably a more middle ground in that Stoic actually loves her and marries her, and she's probably respected even if she's seen as a bit eccentric by everybody on the island. As I said, she marries Stoic, she gives birth to Hiccup, and during a dragon attack on the village, a dragon sneaks into her house and approaches him, so she confronts it. She realizes though that it doesn't want to hurt her or Hiccup and was just curious. When Stoic bursts in, it carries her off thinking it's protecting her and takes her away from her family. It's here that she discovers the truth about dragons. They aren't mindless killing machines that the others on Berk think they are. She was right all along. Thinking that nobody on Berk would be able to change and that Hiccup would be better off being raised by Stoic alone, she stays away for a good 20 years or so, and along the way she becomes a strange hermit whose sole mission in life is to rescue dragons. Eventually, in the second film, Hiccup comes across her island and she somewhat abducts him until she notices his scar, and somewhat pieces together that he must be her son, even though I think the Vikings in this setting are probably going to have a lot of scars, because of all the fighting. Regardless, she somehow knows it's him and reveals herself, and whilst he's apprehensive for all of a minute or two, he very quickly is drawn into her world and they're flying around having fun, and he instantly forgives her for being absent from his life for, well, his entire life up to that point. When Stoic arrives, it's the exact same thing. Whilst she expects him to rage at her, he simply tells her that she's as beautiful as the day he lost her, he kisses her, and he forgives her. From this point onwards, she's simply back into the tribe and the family, and there are no real speed humps. Everything is completely forgiven. However, I guess it never really sat right with me. I know that part of Hiccup's character is being reconciliatory to everybody, even villains, and that since she's very much like him, he feels drawn to her and wants to try to bond with her properly. I get it, but I just don't think it makes for a very compelling narrative. I mean, let's be honest, as a mother, she is the drizzling shits, and there's no two ways about that. Let's frame things from that perspective. She lives in a world where dragons very regularly attack her home village for some reason. They openly attack Berk and they kill and maim Vikings along the way. They steal their food, which could risk people starving. She argues they shouldn't even fight back, which is certainly a perspective to have. Even Hiccup doesn't think like that until he has to look Toothless in the eye and execute him and realizes that this isn't who he is. Remember that even if the Vikings don't fight back, these things will ransack their village anyway since the Red Death is in charge. Once that fella dies, suddenly it's all hunky-dory and they can live in harmony. Until then, not so much. Eventually, Valka's taken by the dragon and she decides this is fine. She's simply not going to go and see her baby or her husband ever again. Is this not wild to anybody else? She decides to take a step back from their whole world, her family, her friends, completely left behind. Despite knowing that dragons are not the aggressive beasts that they seem to be to the Berkians, she never goes and investigates why they might be attacking, why this might all be happening. Remember that Toothless, when prompted, takes Hiccup to see the Red Death to show him the truth about everything. Her dragon came to Berk in the Dragon Raid, so it was clearly from that colony too, right? She never investigates it further though. Hiccup manages to figure this out in a handful of weeks, if that. She has had over a decade to try to figure it out by that point. She gives up on her family. She gives up. She thinks that Stoic can never change, and so she doesn't bother trying, whereas Hiccup proves that they all can change, and on top of that, he never gives up on his family or his tribe. He outright goes to save them from the Red Death when they decide to invade the island to try to kill it. He keeps trying again and again. Already that's weird for her, but on top of that, she knows that her dragons are safe and that Berk is a war zone. So how the hell are you going to let your only child be raised in that sort of dangerous environment? Is that not strange to anybody else at all? Beyond that, she doesn't even go back to try to see him, to watch him from afar. She's clearly never seen him before, and the only feature she somehow recognized was the scar on his chin. That is it. I just think that the storytelling here could be improved in the second remake. It's never sat well with me that through all of this, Hiccup's pretty much instantly massively excited to have Mummy back. There's brief skepticism and slight snark that is then completely eclipsed and brushed off and turned into love in all of 2 and 3 minutes. I simply think that with added time for the movie, they should try to flesh out a bit of their dynamic and storyline to make much more sense from an emotional point of view. I guess you could argue that these sorts of discussions might happen later, in the gap between 2 and 3, and that he was probably simply in shock when he met her, but guess what? We don't get to see that sort of thing in context, and thus I think it is an important thing to showcase. I just think it could add some depth to Hiccup's story in that second film, where he very much falls into a Hiccup knows best mentality. I think this should carry over to his interactions with his mum. How could they go about writing this though? Well, first up there is the easier path of least resistance, that for some reason or another, Valka was unable to return home to Stoic and Hiccup and had to make the best of a bad situation. I don't know how you could make this make sense, but I'm sure there is a way. It allows you to simply start fresh instead of having her do some pretty selfish things and be instantly forgiven for quite literally everything. Like I said though, it's the path of least resistance and it lets you keep all the characterization without too much change to the story. It's also kind of boring. However, I think I would prefer them go in a different direction. Instead, I think you can still keep Hiccup and his mum eventually bonding and realizing how similar they are, but add a bit of nuance. He doesn't have to be angry, but why not have Hiccup somewhat reject his mother at first? He arrives at this place and finds a woman that abandoned him and seemingly wants to pick up where they left off, but for Hiccup, that's kind of nowhere. He doesn't know her, he doesn't remember her, and the absence of her left a big void in the family, one they could never properly fill. Don't get me wrong, I don't think he needs to be overtly cruel to her because in the end, that's not who Hiccup is. You just have to straddle that angsty line and not go too far or you risk making him seem like a bit of a crybaby. Yeah, it would be fair enough to be a crybaby in this context, but it's still bad optics for your heroic Viking protagonist, do you get me? I think that he should be really interested in everything that she's done and bond with her about dragons, but also be very hesitant and distant when it comes to more personal things. He's quite literally a grown man by that part of the story, and so I think some distance is necessary. He can pull away or change the subject when it gets too close to home. Maybe even have him yell at her about things just once. Not too much, but just address the elephant in the room, right? Yeah, Stoic wasn't always a very good dad for Hiccup at all, but at least he was there, you know? I think with that added runtime, there's enough time to have them flesh out this type of dynamic a bit more, instead of speed running to the forgiveness story point. What they should keep, though, is the instant forgiveness and love from Stoic. The dude almost lost his son to the Red Death, and I think him being happy to find out his wife wasn't horribly eaten by a dragon does make a lot of sense. Plus, since he ends up dying almost instantly after this, you'd want time to showcase the romantic side of things too. Speaking of which, you do have the perfect place in the film for Hiccup and Valka to properly reconcile, and for Hiccup to accept her as his mother once again in a way that actually feels kind of earned. Stoic's death, which really does come about as a result of that Hiccup knows best mentality when he tries to talk to Drago, who is well past the point of being saved from his own hatred. When Stoic dies, Hiccup hits rock bottom and he doesn't know what to do, and so Valka can give him some motherly wisdom at long last and tell him what he needs to hear, about how his father had believed that he could bring about a true peace with human and dragons. In their joint grief over the death of Stoic, that's when they can address everything and come together to form a proper bond. I just think it makes more sense. You don't have your protagonist seem too needy and spineless, and you actually address the poor actions of a good character and give her a proper redemption/atonement story point. In the end, I think that's what I want most from these remakes. I want them to take elements that I don't think worked all that well in the original animated films and just change them up a little bit. Also, good visuals, music, and action. All those 4 things, please and thank you. Of course though, in the end, these are just my opinions and you might completely disagree with everything I've said and think my pitch for Valka's character is utter garbage. Or you might agree with me. I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe and let me know.